Okay, welcome to the second morning session here at CG. I want to begin by thanking ACUNS and CG for the chance to be involved with this conference, and I'll note that this is, for the Stanley Foundation, just the latest in a quite close collaboration with CG on a number of projects over the last few years, which has been a very happy partnership. I was glad to hear Barry remind us of what Bruce Jentleson said yesterday about collective action being contingent on multi-level convergence between the key players. Indeed, the point of this panel exactly is to talk about divergence and its implications for continuity or change in the post-war liberal order. One thread of our conference that I've noticed is been about the jockeying between rule makers and rule takers, and our presenters for this session have a lot of insight into that dynamic, especially. What we've asked Ted and Maria to do is to take stock of two key sets of norms, human rights and democracy in Ted's case, and nuclear nonproliferation in Maria's case, and tell us where things stand as the quote-unquote rule takers become more assertive. What effect has that had on the international order? The argument for continuity, I suppose, is that the UDHR, the other human rights instruments, along with the NPT, all remain in place, but that's not a very satisfying answer, I don't think. And of course, Ted and Maria will give a more textured assessment. You have their biographical summaries, so I won't give formal introduction. Ted will go first, and I thought of Ted and this session when I ran across recently this Amartya Sen quote that John Eikenberry used in his recent Foreign Affairs article, and the quote is that while democracy is not yet universally practiced, nor indeed universally accepted, in the general climate of world opinion, democratic governance has achieved the status of being taken to be generally right. And I was intrigued with that quote because in a way it is an answer to the question that we've put before Ted. So he'll go first, and then we'll have Maria next on nonproliferation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, David, for having me up here. My first time in this neck of the woods of Canada and in this beautiful building. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Alistair, for all the work you've done. This is a big topic with lots of different elements that we could talk about all day. So I'm going to try to break it down and be a little focused on it, but also touch on some of the broader themes as the quote that David just gave us would suggest. I definitely see the glass as half full on these issues of democracy and human rights, even though it's still a very contested terrain, and the terminology, that what do these terms actually mean, is still up for debate, unfortunately. But I think in large part and in general terms, the trend line is leaning towards convergence as opposed to divergence, but there's still some very sharp areas of divergence, and it usually has to do with use of force, as we've seen more recently. But I think in general terms, and when it comes to human rights, that international norms are really not the problem. We have a whole set of comprehensive universal norms on human rights, economic and social rights, political rights, most recently the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, on and on. I think the new frontier is LGBT rights, and you're beginning to see even some governmental statements, joint collective governmental statements on that issue. So there are certainly pockets that need more attention, but the norms are really there. The big problem is implementation, right? And so how does the UN system deal with the questions of implementation? I think in general terms, the system, the architecture that's been established over the last several decades is relatively sound. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as I mentioned before, really does remain as the guidepost for all countries. Let me just look at the number of countries, number of languages in which it's been translated. But let's talk more concretely about the newest element of the human rights system, the Human Rights Council, which was created just 4 years ago after a couple of years of intense negotiation in New York. I think, it got off to a rocky start. And there was a lot of skepticism about what's different from the old commission. A lot of my remarks are, I was going to say tainted by being in Washington, which is a very politicized take on the UN system and specifically on the Human Rights Council. It's a very hot topic of debate and usually only gets covered in very negative ways in the media and on the US Congress. But I think even within the human rights community more broadly, there was real skepticism going into the council. But I would say that the facts on the ground, the narrative is really changing for the better. And I would say in part that was due to US engagement. I don't know how much Suzanne Nossel got into this, but I have to give them a fair amount of credit for really going at it in some very smart ways and building kind of cross-regional coalitions on some important issues on human rights. I would want to start this discussion in particular focusing on the newest mechanism within this bundle, which is the Universal Periodic Review process. Universal Periodic Review. So all states are reviewed once every 4 years to evaluate their adherence to the basic norms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one is contesting those norms. It's a question of now how are we doing and performing with those norms. And I think that process is turning out to be a net positive from various vantage points. Number one, it gets you past the selectivity debate, although there are certainly elements of selectivity going on in other parts of the human rights debate. But on this one, everyone's treated the same against the same standards, the same documents are put forward, and that alone is a big change. And every single country has participated. I mean, that's unheard of in the UN human rights system, where treaty bodies don't get reports, countries don't let special rapporteurs visit. Every single country is showing up for their periodic review. What's happening at the national level is that it's elevating human rights on the national agenda of these countries for the first time. It's forcing interagency collaboration. It's opening the door to consultation with civil society in ways that have never happened before. Because what's put in front of the governments for the peer review is not only the government's report, but also a compilation from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and a compilation from civil society. And those are all treated as official inputs into the process and allows for some, in theory, and I think in practice, some tougher questioning. I've talked to human rights activists on the ground who say that it's been a huge advantage for them. It also is serving as a positive reinforcement for other parts of the human rights system, for the treaty bodies and the special procedures whose recommendations are put back on the table. I mean, those mechanisms don't otherwise have any kind of institutionalized follow-up to their visits and reports. And so now that's happening in a useful way. And so I think just in your point about risk takers and risk rule makers and rule takers, this is a case where everyone was involved in making the rules. Everyone's treated the same way in the Universal Periodic Review. Everyone's participating. I think the tests will happen in the next round. There's a second cycle that will begin in 2012 to see, okay, here are the recommendations that you've accepted. how are you doing on implementing them? That's where the rubber will meet the road, but it's a decent start. Other things to mention that go to this issue of norms and implementation. We see a new Freedom of Association Special Rapporteur, which was an initiative that came out of civil society, out of concerns that they were being attacked in a range of countries, new laws being passed to clamp down on their rights. And a very an important activist in Kenya was appointed to serve that position. We saw a breakthrough in the last 6 months on the whole issue of defamation. Now that is an important normative debate that has been going on for years. Well, for the first time, the traditional defamation resolution was off the table. And Pakistan conceded to a new type of resolution that deals with real issues of hate speech, but in a way that's more consonant and balancing concerns about free speech and concerns about incitement to violence. So that's, I think, a big breakthrough. We'll see if it holds. We see now a new special rapporteur on Iran. This is the first country-specific rapporteur that's been created since the Human Rights Council came into being, and we're still waiting for the appointment of that rapporteur. It took a few years to pull it off, but a country like Brazil turned the corner and voted in favor of that position. And then we're seeing some remarkable movement on cases like Libya, Syria, and Cote d'Ivoire. There, the phrasing goes to R2P and protection of civilians, but it's really creating some new precedents that are really interesting. Suspending Libya as a member of the Human Rights Council, a big breakthrough. I mean, it says in the resolution creating the council that if you're a gross violator, you can be suspended, but no one ever thought it would be actually enforced so quickly, and there it was, very quickly enforced. And then beyond that, the Commission of Inquiry that was established. In Syria, a special session to look at Syria and to task the Office of the High Commissioner to investigate. Cote d'Ivoire, also a commission of inquiry to look at the situation in Cote d'Ivoire, which more broadly, I mean, the Cote d'Ivoire story, I think, deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. If you think about the basic principle, even though it was a protection of civilians mandate, we're also talking about de facto a restoration of democracy mandate, where free and fair elections led to the election of a candidate who was denied office, and the international community de facto said that can't stand, and found a way to put the free and fairly elected candidate into office. This is a whole lot of important new ground that's being created, so I think it's a positive trend. Again, the problem is implementation, follow-up, resources. The human rights system is heavily under-resourced and can only do so much. Let me turn now to kind of the democracy word, which is still very much contested. I had the chance to share a cab ride with Joel on the way here, and we were talking about how that works at the World Bank and some of the IFEs, which say we don't do political issues, we don't do democracy, and yet they find all kinds of different words to do just this kind of activity. Rule of law, transparency, accountability, voice, rights-based approach to development, women's rights. All of this is happening, very much being integrated into the development agenda, and I would suggest a tremendous convergence of norms, but a very careful way in which it's phrased and discussed. Good governance is also a safer way of talking about it. We at Brookings are looking more and more at some of these issues. We convened a conference last month looking at the role of the emerging democratic powers and where does democracy and human rights fit in their foreign policies. And one of the things that struck me was the sense that a quick, easy reference to democracy as an ideology, and a contested ideology, which I think is really old-think, if you really think about it. I mean, democracy in traditional terms is really a system of government that protects human rights and fosters prosperity and social equity in practice. I mean, it's no coincidence that the G20 members are all democracies of varying strength, except for China, Saudi Arabia, and probably Russia. I think that's not an accident, and we'll probably see growing convergence between the social, economic development and the political development in some positive ways. Yes, there's the China exception, but I think we have a long talk about what's happening in China and whether their model is sustainable and what the Chinese themselves think about their own political evolution. On my way here, I was reading some of the Bruce Gentleson work, and one of the things relative to this that really jumped out at me was this sense that process is, and I think they were talking about democratic process, what we consider democratic process, is too cumbersome, it's too costly. It gets in the way of social equity outcomes that we care about. I thought that was a pretty radical proposition. It sounds to me like the ends justify the means. We need to care more about the outcomes and not the process we get there. I think that there's really a need for pursuing both if you want to have any kind of legitimacy. I mean, we talk on the international governance agenda of representational legitimacy. Well, I think that's just as much needed at the national level and the local level and the state level. So I think process does matter when you're talking about legitimacy. We have in the UDHR and the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights a principle that's largely never been elevated to any real importance, but it does say that the authority of government derives from governing with the consent of the people through free and fair elections. Authority of government is sovereignty, but there's still a big gap, I think, in seeing legitimacy of national sovereignty in those terms. But in my experience, and I've done a lot of work around something called the Community of Democracies, which is the only global forum of democracies to work together on how to cooperate to support each other in strengthening democracy. There is a quick desire to be seen as a democracy. I mean, we know this from just the names that countries have adopted for themselves, even though they're not democratic. And I think most significantly in the past 6 months, we've seen the Arab awakening. I mean, what more evidence do you need that the democracy and human rights agenda is very much ascendant? The issues at play in Tunisia and Egypt are about human dignity, about having a voice, about political reform and anti-corruption, about women's rights. It's also about a job and education and healthcare, which are also rights. These are, economic social rights that are codified in our international norms. And that's, I think, the big missing area that needs further convergence. I'll come back to that at the end. But the whole Arab situation really turns the table on those who say the Arab world or any other region is not ready for democracy. I mean, there's obviously a long ways to go for this experiment to play out and whether it will survive. But I think it's really shifted the narrative again on maybe turning the democracy recession into a surplus. The convergence of the civil and political rights and the economic and social rights, I think that is the agenda for the future. I think that's where, say, the progress of a Chinese model or Vietnam or others in one area on the economic and social agenda, but not on political rights, will have to confront those deficits that they face in those areas, just as in the developed world, there's huge problems remaining on poverty and inequality. It's actually getting worse in much of the developed world. And I think, speaking in my country, in the United States, I think this is our sore spot. You have a pretty sympathetic president on these issues. He cannot bring himself to talk about economic and social rights in that term, in that language. It's just not understood in our vocabulary. So we still have a long ways to go on that kind of convergence of the norms and thinking human rights more holistically, more interdependently. There's a lot of rhetoric around that, but we're a long ways from making that work. And then finally, just another word on the role of the emerging democracies on the global stage. I mean, as I'm starting to look at this issue, there's some things that, I mean, of course, every country is different. Talking about countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, these countries are certainly striving for greater autonomy. They want stability in their neighborhoods. They want flexibility in who their friends are. They're looking for a role as leaders in the region. Of course, they're looking for high rates of economic growth. And they're also much more comfortable with multilateral mechanisms than unilateral or bilateral initiatives. Now, some of those themes you would think would cut against democracy and human rights, which is quintessentially it's a matter of, it's where it's toughest to find the common ground. It's a matter of internal affairs, but it refers to international standards. But I think that in the minds of many of these governments, as expressed by their presidents and their diplomats, the values issue really still matters very much. Certainly rhetorically. I mean, Indonesia has become a real clear voice in the Asia region. They've created this Bali Democracy Forum. They have a soft way of doing it, but they're very clear when you read their statements about the importance of democracy to their own success. I mean, when you talk about, when Brazilians talk about why they've emerged as a more important country, they're very proud of their transition to democracy. But then they quickly shy away from suggesting that they would want to insert that into their foreign policy, because that would be seen as non-intervention. So there's trying to figure out a way of how they talk about this without looking like they're too close to the United States. I mean, the anti-Western bias is very strong in some of these foreign ministries. But I think as these countries further develop as democracies, you're seeing new actors coming on stage and having some influence in shaping their foreign policy agenda. Civil society certainly, slowly, is getting more involved. I mean, they've traditionally been very focused on human rights within their countries, but they're beginning to look beyond that. Parliament's still a very weak player in many of these countries, but exceptions to the rule, and I think some growing awareness. The business community certainly has a stake in this, and it tends towards not being much on favor of democracy and human rights, but I think there are elements of the business community that are more progressive. Certainly in the academic community, there's an interest in this, and then in the media, there's slowly more transparency, more attention being paid to, oh, Brazil, yeah, how did they vote on Iran? Maybe we should look at this. And some of the media attention, and it certainly became a big campaign issue in Brazil, I think did have an influence on President Dilma Rousseff, who of course has her own personal history as a victim of torture, in making this part of her agenda a break from President Lula. And I think the question is, will that go beyond the Iran vote? Will Brazil become consistently more proactive on the human rights agenda? So until these trends emerge further, I think you're going to see the traditional non-intervention approach tinged with kind of an anti-US, anti-West impulse predominant on these issues. But is there a contest for basic norms? I don't see it. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just say, as someone with pessimistic tendencies myself, I do appreciate hearing a glass half full presentation and perspective. And Ted is a leading authority on these issues. Ted's someone that I've known for many years, whereas Maria Robley is a new colleague and friend. I actually became acquainted with her work by seeing her present at an ISA panel in Montreal, and I was very intrigued with her analysis of nonproliferation and the NPT, not as one norm, but actually as 5 norms, and the connections among those are quite interesting, and so very happy to bring her here to share those.
Thank you, David, very much. And I want to thank ACUNS and the Stanley Foundation for inviting me to come out. It's a little bit of a trip from Auckland. I know some people have traveled further, but I'm delighted to be here. And it's interesting, the linkages between the discussions. I'm just having arrived at the conference this morning. I've already seen multiple linkages with the topics, and I'm excited about that. My talk today is coming up, norm contestation within the nuclear nonproliferation regime. I think my slide title says within the nuclear nonproliferation treaty. And just a couple words of background on this topic. The ISA panel that David referenced, I'm actually working on an edited volume with Nina Tannenwald, Harold Mueller, and Avner Cohen on nuclear norms. I mean, there's so much of the discussion and debate when it comes to nuclear politics is focused on strategic and material concerns. There's not that much, very little work actually done on ideational impacts. And of course, my own book, Nonproliferation Norms, Why States Choose Nuclear Restraint, is one of the works that's been looking at this. Of course, Nina Tannenwald has been a leader in this field for a while. But we're really interested in how the norms collide with the material interests and what results that leads to. So this talk that I'm giving is actually coming from the chapters in that book. The second thing I want to talk about is after ISA, I actually gave a presentation, was asked to talk at a U.S. government conference. The conference was, the question of the conference was, why do states who profess to care about nonproliferation and disarmament refuse to support additional nonproliferation measures, such as sanctions, such as making the additional protocol universal and required? And you'll see in part what my answer is to that, but essentially I use social psychology to make the argument that because the NPT is not just about nonproliferation, and if you think the NPT is just about nonproliferation, you're not going to understand these debates and the concerns. You're not going to understand Iran, you're not going to understand Japan, and so that's my talk today. The health of the NPT is widely debated, both in policy and academic circles. Is it in crisis, in retreat, in collapse? Is it in good health, as some people have recently argued? And I would say that this whole debate, the argument's very widely, and the debate and the confusion comes from what we mean by the normative content of the NPT. And almost all discussions of the NPT focus on the nonproliferation norm. There's virtually no recognition that there are several norms embedded within the NPT. And most of these norms, they're not necessarily mutually supportive, and in today's diplomatic and strategic environment, they're often very much in tension with each other. So let's look at the norms within the NPT. So norms use the standard Finnemore-Sicking definition, shared standards of acceptable behavior. So what are the different norms embedded within the NPT? Of course, we have the norm of nonproliferation, the norm of safeguards, inspections, the norm of peaceful nuclear use, the norm of disarmament, and we can't forget the norm of self-defense. Now, there's some obvious norm competition here, and this is where I'd actually like to spend most of my talk on. Peaceful use versus nonproliferation. Of course, Iran argues that its interest in uranium enrichment is for peaceful use, civilian technology. The concern of the international community is that they're violating nonproliferation commitments. So, it's difficult to tease these out, but there's been evidence, and especially evidence recently, for example, looking at neutron triggers, that there's clear indication of interest in nuclear weapons as well. But there's norm competition here, and it's hard to say to Iran, sorry, you're completely wrong, because they're not. Because there's actually, within the NPT, the right for peaceful civilian technology. Of course, self-defense versus nonproliferation. States are actually allowed to withdraw from the NPT if they feel like their national security is severely threatened, and that's been North Korea's argument. Self-defense versus disarmament. I don't know if you caught this, but a few years ago, when the Iran crisis was heating up at one of its moments, an official in France said, well, we're not going to be able to talk about nuclear disarmament because we have concerns about Iran, and until we resolve Iran, we can't really talk about nuclear disarmament. So, here's some more obvious norm competition. Some other important tensions that people may not realize, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Brazilian nuclear program, back several years ago, there were concerns about their own uranium enrichment plant at Resende, and they did not allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors full access to their centrifuges. They actually had them partially shielded, and their argument was that we have a special type of centrifuge that uses magnets to levitate, and they're 30% more efficient, and we don't want our industrial secrets stolen. The concern here is if a member of the NPT in good standing will not allow full visual access by the IAEA, how in the world are we going to solve issues with Iran and North Korea, and when states who have violated parts of their IAEA agreements? And so there was actually quite a lot of negotiation and concern. There are also reasons for concern in Brazil. For example, the former Brazilian vice president had come out and said Brazil needs nuclear weapons. Brazil's nuclear submarine program is important to our status and legitimacy, and also gives us a stepping stone to, HEU, highly enriched uranium. Of course, the vice president is not the same party as the president, and you can't take this as, sort of a policy statement by Brazil. But still, these types of statements and comments combined with the problems about inspections are a real concern. And again, we cannot simply say, Brazil, you're wrong, 100%, straighten up, you need to fulfill your NPT obligations, because they were fulfilling their NPT obligations. There's nothing in their IAEA inspection agreement, which actually is complicated if you're familiar with the region. It's not the typical agreement, that says they have to give full visual access. Peaceful use versus disarmament. One of the concerns, if you're familiar with the work, The Nuclear Tipping Point, and other works that have been done recently, the concern is that if nuclear weapon states do not get to work on disarmament, we're going to see a spread of nuclear weapons. We could see a proliferation tipping point. And so this is a concern to people who care about proliferation. So we've had conservatives come on board with the nuclear disarmament movement, saying this is important because we don't want to see more proliferation. So let's get to work on disarmament. Even if we never get there, it's okay. We can have some rhetoric, have some action, but this is important. I've actually heard flat out not policy statements, but statements like that from policy officials off the record. On the other hand, people who care about disarmament are concerned because they know if there's greater proliferation, we're going to see real concern among nuclear weapon states being willing to give up their nuclear weapons, such as the case of France. So this is another very important tension, especially when it comes to threshold states. Nuclear threshold states are those who could develop nuclear weapons within 2 to 3 years, depending on the timeline you look at. And so we include states like Brazil and Japan. Potentially Egypt is on the cusp, Argentina, etc. And the more states that want to acquire uranium enrichment technology, the less likely nuclear weapon states are going to be willing to give up their nuclear weapons, or at least make substantial progress in that direction. Because of course uranium enrichment can be done for civilian nuclear fuel, or if you just keep it in the centrifuges a little longer, not a little longer, but somewhat longer, you have weapons-grade fissile material. And so there's debates about limiting the spread of uranium enrichment. And of course, from a U.S. perspective, this is a good thing. Let's limit it because we need to stop the spread of this technology that can create nuclear weapons, which stops proliferation, and it also will encourage nuclear weapon states to disarm because they won't be so worried about all these nuclear competitors. But from the point of view of states, other states outside sort of this Western-centric sphere, you say, hold on a second. We have the right to uranium enrichment. We have the right to peaceful nuclear technology. And if we do have a nuclear renaissance coming, we want to be there. We want to be selling our equipment. We want to be selling centrifuge equipment. And this shouldn't be locked down. So there's real tensions here. This is not just rhetoric. This is we haven't been able to solve this. In fact, at one of the nuclear suppliers group, there was an argument, actually a proposal put on the table that we will no longer sell certain types of equipment to countries unless they have signed the additional protocol, which gives IAEA inspectors much greater access to nuclear facilities. And Brazil blocked it and said, no, no thank you. And they were able to block that measure. So these, when I say tensions, these are actually tensions happening right now. And then, of course, the issue of disarmament versus nonproliferation. Japan, some officials within Japan, after Barack Obama gave his speech in Prague about how the U.S. needs to lead the disarmament movement, has a moral obligation to do so, some Japanese officials actually approached Washington officials in Washington, D.C., and expressed hesitancy and said, if you go full bore ahead on disarmament, we're going to have to start thinking about our own nuclear weapons. They didn't say it in those terms, but that's what they were saying, based on my interviews with officials in D.C. and within Tokyo. So again, here's another tension. How fast do you proceed with disarmament, and how could that affect potential proliferation? So I want to say these are not just rhetoric. I've had people say, Iran is just saying peaceful use this is just a cover. It's actually not just a cover. This is actually a matter of domestic political legitimacy. And in fact, Ahmadinejad tried to accept an offer put forward by the IAEA, which would allow material to be taken out of Iran, enriched in Russia, and then brought back to Iran. He tentatively agreed to this, and then when he got back to Iran, he was bombarded with attacks by the progressives, who said, you've just given up our inalienable right to civilian nuclear technology, and he had to back down. So this is not just rhetoric, this is based in domestic politics. It's also based on very different experiences from countries. At this US government conference on that question I talked about, I counseled the other participants, you have to remember these countries and these elites have very different experiences. This sentiments of colonialism, the feelings of being shut out of the international financial institutions, of the Security Council. And they're not, there's a feeling that they've backed down enough, and that these norms are clearly coded within the NPT, and they're not going to back down. And this doesn't just come from rhetoric, this is also comes from experiences. So, that's a pretty negative portrait, I think. How do we resolve this competition, short of rewriting the NPT, which will not happen? How do we manage the competition among the norms within the NPT? And my own work looks at social psychology and how norms actually influence decision makers, both their perceptions and the actual policy outputs. And social psychology says that there are ways you can handle norm competition. All of us deal with norm competition in our own lives. One is to prioritize norms and to say, okay, if we would like to fulfill all of these norms, we can't do them all at once because they're in contention. So what we have to do is find a way, make a sort of a normative path. If we can get a handle on this one first while we do this, and then later we can have this, and actually set out a path to prioritize the path so that you can, in the end, fulfill all of the different norms. And that's certainly arguments being made, if you're familiar with the work of Scott Sagan on the issue. He's been arguing, for example, that the disarmament norm, it's not just an obligation of the nuclear weapon states, but it's an obligation of the non-nuclear weapon states. They have obligations for disarmament also, and that they need to prioritize that over the norm of peaceful use in terms of the spread of uranium enrichment technology. Another way is to link norms, and in social psychology literature, it's clear one of the best ways to get someone to accept a norm, to be persuaded, is to link it to a norm that they already hold very dearly. And so finding ways to link these norms that may be causing tension to norms that are already held in countries that we're concerned about would be very important. One way to think about this would be multilateral fuel banks. For example, Brazil, they're very proud of their nuclear technology. Part of the issue over their centrifuges is there's a claim that the centrifuge technology was actually stolen from Germany, and that just hits at the heart of the Brazilians who say, no, this is indigenous technology, and that's this real slur. So I think linking the Brazilians to lead a regional multilateral fuel bank would be a great idea to link to that norm of technological expertise when it comes to nuclear, and also help resolve the tension of peaceful use versus proliferation. Finally, you can fold NPT norms under the broader norm, and again, this is going to take some serious intellectual and creative thinking here, as well as policy negotiation. But if you look at the broad norm of the NPT, which is universal disarmament, and nuclear disarmament is one step along that way, that would be another way of folding these norms under a broader norm. And the key point here is this is not something that the U.S. or the U.S. and NATO or Western countries can do on their own. These tests are going to have to be done in dialogue and in debate with partners all around the world. We have to move beyond the Western-centric view that the nonproliferation norm is the most important norm and these others all fall under it. That's not the way other countries perceive it. Finally, I want to talk about norms for whom. So the goal of the NPT is international peace and security, and a critical theorist might ask, well, peace and security for whom? Norms are shared standards of acceptable behavior among actors of a given identity. And in my own research, I found that actors outside the status quo are likely to reject norm enforcement. In fact, they gain status by rejecting norm enforcement. So as we discuss these norms, we have to keep this in mind, that not all states in the world feel that they're part of the status quo. They all don't want to support the status quo. And this links into the earlier discussion about the UN Security Council reform of international financial institutions. And finally, we must remember that, as I said, the nonproliferation norm is not the only norm within the NPT. And this is not just rhetoric. It's shaped by both the material and ideational experiences of dissenting states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And let's take some questions now. If nobody else is going first, start with Tom. Yeah. I was really struck by your point that everybody was given a rule maker relationship to that too.
I'm thinking off the top of my head in some other ways it could be done. I'm going back to the time that I actually worked in government, and there was a very contested debate between North America and Latin America over drug issues, drug trafficking, and the U.S. had this unilateral certification process, and it became a major irritant in our relations with certain countries. And so what we came up with was this multilateral evaluation mechanism under the umbrella of the Organization of American States, which really diffused the tension and allowed everyone to buy in to what the standards were, and each state had to come forward with their own set of reporting against these standards. And it I think brought people into to buy into what the drug trafficking threat was all about and how to address it. In thinking about how it relates to issues like elections, when we have some experience already, specifically on the Human Rights Council, that there is a norm established in the resolution creating the council that states are to, if you want to be a member of the council, you need to make pledges. Not need, you should. You're encouraged to make pledges, and you need to uphold the basic standards of human rights, be kind of a member in good standing. Now we know in practice, looking at the membership, a lot of people ask, well, why was Libya on the council in the first place when they got suspended? And you've got a whole lot of regional politics dynamics going on to explain that. But I have to say that in every single case in which there was a choice, in which there was a competitive slate, in which states could choose between Sri Lanka and some other candidate, or between Azerbaijan or others, there's been a campaign and an opening for states and civil society to do some lobbying and say, you know, that state should not be elected. Belarus is another example. Belarus, which had just been condemned by the General Assembly for its human rights violations, then was trying to run for a seat in the Human Rights Council, and finally, you know, a line was drawn. So there's some precedent setting going on there as well. I'd have to think harder in some other areas, but I think there's a general allergic reaction on the criteria for membership issue in the UN. You know, everyone should be eligible, and this is a universal organization. So I think that's even one of the harder areas, and I'm surprised we've gotten this far on the Human Rights Council.
Here, and then. Should we take a few at a time?
Okay, my name is Michael Platzer, and I was part of the UPR process in Austria, which I found to be a very positive experience, even in terms of Austrian internal improvements. But my discussion with you, I think, is about, you said there's no contest for basic norms, and I'm wondering how you see the discussion about values, particularly the introduction of the value discussion from Russia, from China, Asian values, African values, and how they have impacted on things like the argument of LGBT or even women's rights, which seem to be sliding backwards. I mean, it seems that Western groups have to be fighting very hard and very vigilantly not to allow the values discussion to erode the traditional, more or less accepted rights.
I just want to throw a few pebbles to break some glass. First, on the protection of civilians. I mean, I'm less optimistic on the more recent developments. Côte d'Ivoire, Libya, in both cases, protection of civilians was invoked for the use of force. And there was some political logic in actually that leading to regime change. But that is not where the consensus of the member states is. In the case of Libya, I think both the countries that were pushing for the resolution and those who were reluctant but did not veto thought this would be a quick affair, and so better be on the side of victory and then forget about it. It turned out differently. And so the concept of protection of civilians may actually be jeopardized by those two experiences in the future. Second, to link that issue to the proliferation debate, I think when one compares Libya and North Korea, it's clear that Gaddafi was very unwise to abandon his nuclear program. And that lesson will not be lost on any dictator. I mean, one of the great lessons of the Libyan intervention is that it's extremely wise for a dictator to pursue a nuclear program, but to do it as secretly as possible. And so one can see the Libyan intervention as one big incentive for proliferation.
And then all the way in the back.
Walter Dorn from the Canadian Forces College. On the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, you've laid out the concept of norm competition, very useful one. But I'm wondering, to what extent does the scholarship on the grand bargain apply? The grand bargain meaning that the nuclear weapon states would disarm and the nuclear non-weapon states would not acquire nuclear weapons. Is that really a central bargain? Was it in '68? Is it now? And to what extent do the nuclear weapon states have to disarm to zero? Is that a commitment under the NPT, or how is that interpreted? Thank you.
Oh, great questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
On the values debate, you know, I guess my first answer is, look what's happening in the Arab world, and doesn't that put that debate aside, because it is all about appealing to universal values in a part of the world that has been very reluctant to accept what you might otherwise call Western values. I mean, I think there's no better proof of that. But you're still seeing, I would call it really reservoirs, pockets of attempts to assert, but they're specific in specific areas like LGBT. There is a resolution that's come up from time to time that Russia puts forward and gets a lot of support about traditional values, and it's I think very much asserting the non-intervention issue. And I think the other interesting development that's happening is you're beginning to see more and more development of regional human rights institutions, and concern is, are those going to be a watered down version of the universal UN norms, and is that a threat to the UN system? So far, I think it's not really turning out that way, in part because there's a lot of effort to mobilize and organize civil society organizations, human rights defenders, to use those mechanisms in a fairly proactive way, so you're getting outcomes that do refer back to the universal norms, but it's something to watch for sure. Jean-Marie, on protection of civilians, I think you're right that there's a lot of concern about the backlash on the Libya case. Yeah, they were looking for a quick victory, but they were still invoking this R2P thing that, you know, everyone thought was just going to be hanging out there for a long time as decoration, but actually the fact that it's being invoked in a real case involving military intervention, and this goes back to the values thing, the fact that the Arab League came out in support of it, you know, also gave really important political cover to say, oh, we are all on board. Now, Libya, you could say, is really the exception that proves the rule. I mean, Libya's special case, already isolated, had no friends, so it was relatively easy to join the bandwagon. But whether, and of course you didn't see that happening, and you're not seeing it happen now with Syria, even though the regime is, you know, every day, just yesterday, I mean, just killing people left and right who come out to protest peacefully. So there's quickly a question about selectivity and why isn't Syria or Bahrain being treated the same way as Libya. I think that's going to be kind of the normal course of contestation of these issues. Each case is going to be a little different. We'll have to see if there's going to be another Libya case, but it looks like it's not going to end that quickly, right? So the longer it goes on, I think the harder it's going to be to kind of really see that as an advance.
Thank you for the questions. I agree that Libya does present a very interesting lessons when it comes to nuclear weapons. Of course, the lesson we had talked about previously was that Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons and was invaded. North Korea had them and wasn't invaded, and therefore what's the lesson for Iran? You know, sort of not a very positive lesson in terms of stopping proliferation. Of course, now we have the issue of Libya. I think I have two responses to that. The first is it's actually not as bad as it seems, because who's going to learn this lesson? What type of rogue state's going to want is concerned about it? You know, this type of intervention. I mean, there's Myanmar, you know, which has rumored a nuclear weapons program. The debate is very interesting on that. Iran, of course, but I don't think Iran's position is going to be affected by Libya. I mean, this is already a very hard problem to solve. I don't think that makes it all that much harder. But I think, so from that perspective, I don't think it's that terrible. But the larger perspective here, more generally, is that it's always advantageous to have something in your back pocket. And when it comes to uranium enrichment programs, I think it's going to make it that much harder for countries who don't necessarily support today's status quo to say, okay, we're willing to go with multilateral enrichment as opposed to having national capacity. It's a real problem because it does give them something in their back pocket. When it comes to the NPT, you're right, there is really interesting scholarship being done on the grand bargain. And the argument that I've heard in some cases is the grand bargain is nuclear weapon states agree to disarm, non-nuclear weapon states agree not to pursue nuclear weapons. And is this really what was meant in the 1960s? And there's been a lot of archival research done. It's really interesting. And in the case of, for the US and the Soviets, the research shows pretty well that they didn't really mean it like that they were just saying this to get states to sign on. They were mostly concerned about Japan and Germany. But my pushback to that scholarship is, but what did the non-nuclear weapon states think? Did they believe the grand bargain? Did they believe what the US and the Soviets were saying? And the answer is yes. And actually, the grand bargain may not have meant much to the US and the Soviets, but it meant the world to the states who were signing on, forswearing the option of nuclear weapons for 25 years, and then at the 1995 Review Conference, forswearing them forever. And I actually was in a little intellectual interchange with a scholar from India who argued that the promise for disarmament is worthless and always meant nothing and always will mean nothing. And taking it from the point of view of the US and Russia and states like India and Pakistan. And I argue that actually that's not the case, that states, non-nuclear weapon states act based on the promise for disarmament, and if that promise for disarmament was not there, we wouldn't have had the NPT. And if, for example, the US came out and said we have no intention of ever disarming, to what extent do you think states would want to continue to support the NPT, let alone allow in IAEA inspectors, let alone agree to additional nonproliferation commitments? So while, you know, it's interesting to think about the historical origins and viewpoints on the grand bargain, you also have to say, in its current context, without this promise for disarmament, the NPT wouldn't function. And if you don't care about that, that's fine, but most people in both academia and policy do. And you've also brought up a great question. Do nuclear weapon states really have to get to zero? And does the NPT state this? And actually the NPT does not. The NPT, and teaching in New Zealand, and I've brought this out in my classes on nuclear politics, and students grit their teeth, you know, they don't really want to hear this, but it says that they have to promise in good faith to negotiate toward disarmament, and there's not a commitment to get to zero. However, does that mean that states don't have to work toward zero? Again, you know, we've got the text of the NPT, but we also have expectations of states whose cooperation is critical to the success of preventing proliferation and moving toward disarmament. And I would argue that, personally, you know, if I were in an important policy position, whether you think we can ever reach global zero or not actually doesn't matter that much, because we have to move in that direction. And if we can move to the point where the US has 500 or 100 nuclear weapons, and we can sit there for a while and, you know, see what type of cooperative behaviors and habits can coalesce internationally, then we may not be able to see the way to zero from here, but once we're there and we can see what cooperation develops, we may be able to see it very clearly from that point. And, you know, I tell people who call me an idealist, who ever thought that Germany and France would have a common currency? You know, if you asked that 100, 150 years ago, people would have laughed at you. So you don't know what can happen, and we've got to move forward on this, would be my policy recommendation.
Thanks. Last question or two, going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. One thing I come away from this with is that for those of us who are concerned about closing some of the gaps in global government or strengthening a rules-based international order, the importance of spreading a sense of ownership came through with both of your presentations, whether it was Maria talking not only about the need to recognize all of the sub-norms of the NPT, but when you were talking about you know, way forward, you were talking about how it can be useful to stress norms that are valued by countries who pose problems, and other norms, and that there may be ways to leverage that. And then Ted not only talked about the Universal Periodic Review, but your anecdote about the case with the OAS also seemed to speak very much to how things can really kind of switch on like a switch when there is that sense of ownership. And sometimes you hear the Obama foreign policy described as having a theme of the quote-unquote dignity agenda, and maybe dignity is another word for ownership in some of these contexts. But I'm really pleased to have had both of those presentations. They're just what I was looking for, and I think that our colleagues also appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.